Come closer. I have a story for you tonight. One that kept me up past midnight when I first discovered it. It's about a woman who was told her entire life that her body was a burden, a shame, a reason no man would ever want her, and the Duke who looked at her with hunger that terrified her far more than all the mockery ever had. This is the Duke's revenge, and I'm so glad you're here. Tell me, where in the world am I reaching you tonight? Whether you're in bed, on a train, cooking dinner, or hiding from responsibilities, drop your location and your local time below. I love knowing who's listening. Philippa Hartwell had spent 24 years learning to disappear, to make herself small in doorways, to choose seats in shadowed corners, to dress in colors that wouldn't draw the eye. She had mastered the art of invisibility so completely that she sometimes wondered if she would simply fade away entirely, become nothing more than a whisper of fabric and the faint scent of lavender, soap. But there was no disappearing from this moment. She stood in the center of a candlelit bedchamber that was not her own, wearing a nightgown of finest lawn that suddenly felt as substantial as morning mist. And the Duke of Whitmore was looking at her with an expression that made her forget how to breathe. Our tale begins in the autumn of 1856, but first, let me take you to that wedding night. To the moment everything Philippa believed about herself shattered into 1,000 glittering pieces. The chamber was enormous, dominated by a 4-poster bed hung with emerald velvet that seemed to absorb the candlelight rather than reflect it. A fire crackled in the massive hearth, casting dancing shadows across walls lined with portraits of Whitmore ancestors who seemed to watch the proceedings with aristocratic disapproval. The air smelled of beeswax and wood smoke, and something else, something darker and more dangerous that Philippa would later identify as desire. Lysander Vane, 6th Duke of Whitmore, stood by the window with his back to her, his silhouette carved in sharp relief against the moon-silvered glass. He had removed his cravat and coat, leaving him in shirt sleeves that did nothing to disguise the breadth of his shoulders or the controlled power in every line of his body. His hair, dark as a raven's wing, curled slightly at his collar, where sweat had dampened it during their interminable wedding dinner. He had barely looked at her all evening, but she had seen him look at Lady Cecily Ashworth, had watched the golden beauty approach him at the wedding breakfast, her slender fingers trailing along his arm, her perfect rosebud mouth curved in a smile that promised everything Philippa could never offer. Had watched Lady Cecily whisper something in his ear that made several guests gasp, something that should have been scandalous, but somehow looked elegant when she did it. And she had watched Lysander remove Lady Cecily's hand from his arm with cold precision and walk away without a word. It should have reassured her. Instead, it only deepened her confusion. Why would any man choose the fat daughter when Lady Cecily Ashworth, the most beautiful woman in England, the woman everyone had expected him to marry, was right there, offering herself on a silver platter? Philippa's hands trembled as she clutched the edges of her wrapper, drawing it tighter around the body she had been taught to despise. She knew what was expected of her. Her mother had explained the marital duty in excruciating, humiliating detail, emphasizing that Philippa must lie still, remain silent, and allow her husband to do what was necessary to produce an heir. She had made it clear that Philippa should be grateful, pathetically, desperately grateful, that any man had agreed to this marriage at all. The fat daughter, the plain one, the one they whispered about at every ball, every dinner party, every gathering where Philippa's curves were measured against her sister Honoria's willowy elegance and found grotesquely wanting. Now, it's important to understand what this kind of persistent cruelty did to a woman in 1856 England. Society had very specific expectations for female bodies, and those expectations were not merely aesthetic preferences. They were moral judgments wrapped in the language of health and propriety. A slender figure suggested discipline, virtue, self-control. A fuller figure suggested excess, indulgence, a fundamental lack of the restraint that made a woman marriageable. When society looked at Philippa Hartwell, they did not see a woman. They saw a failure. And Philippa had learned to see herself exactly as they saw her. The Duke turned from the window, and Philippa felt her heart stutter in her chest. Even now, even after hours of sitting beside him at their wedding breakfast, she could not quite believe this man was real. He was too beautiful, too cold, too completely beyond anything she had ever imagined wanting, let alone having. Lysander Vane had a face that belonged on a Roman coin. Sharp cheekbones, an aquiline nose, a jaw that looked carved from granite and just as unyielding. His eyes were the gray of a winter storm, pale and penetrating, and they moved over her now with an intensity that made Philippa want to shrink into the carpet and disappear. Instead, she lifted her chin. If she was to be inspected like livestock at market, she would at least maintain some dignity. "Remove the wrapper," he said. His voice was low, cultured, utterly without warmth. A command, not a request. Philippa's fingers tightened on the fabric. "Your Grace, Remove it." He crossed the distance between them in 3 long strides, stopping close enough that she could smell him. Sandalwood and leather, and something indefinably male that made her knees weak with a feeling she couldn't name. "I want to see what I've claimed." The words landed like blows, what he'd claimed, as if she were territory conquered, a prize won in some game she hadn't known she was playing. Philippa felt her eyes burn with humiliation, but she refused to cry. She had learned long ago that tears only made the mockery worse. She let the wrapper fall. It pooled around her feet in a whisper of silk, leaving her standing before him in nothing but the thin lawn nightgown that her mother had chosen specifically because it was modest, because it would hide Philippa's shameful abundance beneath layers of virginal white. But the firelight behind her turned the fabric transparent, and Philippa watched the Duke's expression change as he saw, truly saw, what lay beneath. She waited for the disgust, for the curl of his lip, the slight recoil, the careful mask of polite indifference that men always assumed when confronted with her body. She had seen it 100 times at balls, when her dance card remained empty while Honoria's overflowed. She had felt it in every pitying glance, every whispered comment, every moment of her life when she had been made to understand that her flesh was an offense against nature and good taste. But the Duke of Whitmore did not look disgusted. He looked hungry. "Turn around," he said, and his voice had changed. Rougher now, darker, stripped of its aristocratic polish. Slowly. Philippa turned, her face burning, her entire body burning with shame, and something else. Something that felt terrifyingly like the hunger she saw in his eyes. She felt his gaze trace the curve of her spine, the flare of her hips, the abundance that society had taught her to despise, and she waited for the inevitable moment when he would dismiss her, send her to her own chambers, explain that this had all been a terrible mistake. Instead, she heard him exhale, a sharp, ragged sound that seemed torn from somewhere deep in his chest. "Look at me." She completed her turn and found him closer than before, close enough that she could see the muscle ticking in his jaw, the way his hands had fisted at his sides, as if he were restraining himself from something. His gray eyes were no longer cold. They burned with an intensity that made her breath catch. "For 7 months," he said quietly, "I have watched you across ballrooms, pretending not to see you. For 7 months, I have listened to society mock you, dismiss you, call you unmarriageable, while every fiber of my being screamed to claim you before anyone else could see what I saw. For 7 months, I have filled an entire room with paintings of you, with sketches commissioned from artists who thought me mad, with every scrap of information I could gather about who you are and what you dream and why you hide yourself from a world too stupid to recognize your worth." Philippa stared at him, certain she had misheard. "An entire room? I will show you tomorrow." A ghost of something that might have been a smile crossed his severe features. "Tonight, I want you to understand something else entirely." He reached out then, his fingers brushing her cheek with a gentleness that seemed impossible from a man so carved from ice and authority. Philippa flinched, an involuntary response to a lifetime of cruelty, and she saw something dangerous flash in his eyes. "Who?" His voice had gone deadly soft. "Who made you afraid to be touched?" "Everyone," she whispered before she could stop herself. "Everyone has always—" "Then everyone," he said, and there was a promise in his voice that made her shiver, "will learn what it costs to hurt what belongs to me. Starting with Lord Pemberton, continuing with Lady Cecily, and ending," his jaw tightened, "ending with your mother." The name sent ice through her veins. "Pemberton, I understand. But Lady Cecily, my mother? What have they—" "Lady Cecily Ashworth has spent the last month telling everyone who would listen that you must have trapped me somehow, that you used witchcraft or blackmail or some other dark art to snare a man who would never willingly choose—" He stopped, visibly controlling himself. Her exact words were, "a creature like that." She said them at Lady Pemberton's tea, knowing they would reach your ears, knowing they would hurt you. Philippa's stomach churned. She had heard the whispers, of course, had felt the weight of Lady Cecily's contemptuous gaze at every gathering, but she hadn't known about the tea party, hadn't known how specific, how deliberate the cruelty had been. "And my mother?" she asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know. "Your mother told Lady Cecily that she agreed with every word, that you were an embarrassment to the family, that she could not understand what madness had possessed me, and that she hoped I would come to my senses before it was too late." Lysander's voice had gone flat, terrifying in its lack of emotion. "She said this 3 days ago, Philippa, after I had already announced our engagement, after I had already made my intentions clear to every person in London. The betrayal shouldn't have surprised her. Lady Minerva had spent 24 years making her disappointment in her elder daughter abundantly clear. But there was something different about knowing that her mother had actively conspired with Lady Cecily, had validated the cruelty, had added her voice to the chorus of people determined to make Philippa feel worthless. "I have plans for both of them," Lysander continued, "but those plans can wait until tomorrow. Tonight." His thumb traced her lower lip, feather light. "Tonight is about you learning that your body is not a burden. It is a gift, and I intend to worship it until you believe me." He stepped back then, putting distance between them, and Philippa felt the absence of his nearness like a physical loss. She stood there, trembling in her transparent nightgown, utterly confused by everything that had just happened. "We will not consummate this marriage tonight," he said, his voice returning to its controlled cool. "When I take you, and I will take you, Philippa, make no mistake about that. It will not be because duty requires it. It will be because you want me as desperately as I have wanted you since the moment I first saw you, standing alone in Lady Ashworth's garden, feeding cake to the swans because no one had asked you to dance." Philippa's breath caught. That had been 7 months ago, the night of her 24th birthday, the night she had given up hope entirely and retreated to the garden to weep where no one could see her. "You were there," she whispered. "You saw." I saw a woman of extraordinary beauty hiding herself from a world too stupid to recognize what stood before them. He moved toward the door, pausing with his hand on the handle. I have waited 7 months to make you mine. I have filled a room with evidence of my obsession. I have planned the systematic destruction of every person who ever made you feel small. I can wait a little longer for you to understand that you are not the burden they convinced you that you were. You are the prize I have spent my entire life searching for. And then he was gone, leaving Philippa alone in the candlelit chamber with a heart that didn't know whether to break or sing. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to that September evening 7 months before, when a duke first glimpsed a lonely woman in a moonlit garden and began planning a courtship that would shake English society to its foundations. The leaves were just beginning to turn when Philippa Hartwell arrived at Lady Ashworth's autumn ball, already exhausted by an evening that had barely begun. The carriage ride from their townhouse in Mayfair had been an exercise in familiar humiliation, her mother's voice filling the cramped space with disappointment and barely concealed desperation. You will smile tonight, Philippa. You will make pleasant conversation. You will not spend the entire evening hiding behind potted plants like some sort of overgrown weed. Lady Minerva Hartwell had been beautiful once, was beautiful still, truth be told, with the same golden hair and delicate features she had passed to Honoria, but somehow failed to bestow upon her elder daughter. Time had sharpened her elegance rather than dimming it, and she wielded her appearance like a weapon, using it to cut at the daughter who had failed to inherit her graces. "Yes, Mama," Philippa murmured, the response automatic, meaningless, a formula recited so often it had lost all connection to intention. And for heaven's sake, try to stand up straight. Slouching only makes your figure more prominent. Honoria, seated across from them in a gown of pale blue silk that made her look like a spring morning incarnate, had the grace to look uncomfortable at their mother's words. At 19, Honoria Hartwell was everything Philippa was not. Slender, golden, effortlessly charming, the kind of young woman who inspired poetry and duels and marriage, proposals by the dozen. She had her pick of London's most eligible bachelors, and their mother never let Philippa forget it. "Mama," Honoria said quietly, "perhaps we might—" "Hush, dear. Save your voice for the gentleman." Lady Minerva smoothed her gloves with practiced precision. "One of us must make a favorable impression tonight. Lady Cecily Ashworth will be there, the hostess's daughter, you know, and I've heard she has her eye on the Duke of Whitmore. If we're lucky, perhaps her attention will distract from—" She gestured vaguely toward Philippa. "Well." The carriage rolled to a stop, and Philippa gathered what remained of her dignity as she prepared to face another evening of whispers and averted gazes, and the special kind of loneliness that came from standing in a room full of people who had all decided she didn't exist. Lady Ashworth's ballroom was a cathedral of candlelight, crystal chandeliers blazing overhead like captured constellations, their brilliance reflected in the polished marble floors and the jewels adorning every throat and wrist. The cream of London society had gathered in their autumn finest, silks and satins in every shade of bronze and amber and deep burgundy, the colors of falling leaves translated into fabric and fortune. The scent of hothouse flowers mingled with French perfume and the particular musk of too many bodies generating too much heat, creating an atmosphere that felt almost suffocating in its opulence. At the center of it all, like a golden sun around which lesser planets orbited, stood Lady Cecily Ashworth. She was, by any objective measure, the most beautiful woman in England. Tall and willowy, with hair the color of spun honey and eyes like summer sky, she moved through the crowd with the effortless grace of someone who had never known a moment's doubt about her own worth. Her gown was cloth of gold that caught the candlelight and threw it back in dazzling patterns, and her smile was the practiced weapon of a woman who knew exactly how much power beauty conferred. Tonight, that smile was aimed at a man standing at the edge of the ballroom. Philippa followed Lady Cecily's gaze and felt her breath catch in her throat. She knew this man. Everyone knew this man. His portrait had been in every newspaper, his name on every tongue, his presence at any gathering the subject of fevered speculation and female swooning. Lysander Vane, 6th Duke of Whitmore, was widely considered the most eligible bachelor in England. He was also considered the coldest, the most forbidding, the most utterly unattainable. At 32, he had never married, never shown serious interest in any woman, despite the legions who had thrown themselves in his path. Gossip columnists had nicknamed him the Ice Duke, and those who had been on the receiving end of his glacial stare said the name was generous. He stood now with his back to the wall, a glass of champagne in his hand that he had not touched, watching the proceedings with an expression of profound boredom. His evening clothes were stark black, without a single ornament to soften his severity, and his face was carved marble, all sharp angles and aristocratic disdain. Lady Cecily approached him with the confidence of a woman who had never been refused anything. Philippa watched her say something that made the people around them titter with laughter, watched her place a delicate hand on the Duke's arm in a gesture that was just intimate enough to spark whispers without being improper. The Duke's expression did not change. He looked at Lady Cecily's hand as if it were something unpleasant that had landed on his sleeve, then raised his eyes to meet hers with a coldness that should have frozen her where she stood. "Lady Cecily," he said, and his voice carried clearly across the crowd. Deliberately, Philippa suspected, because the Duke of Whitmore did nothing by accident. "I find myself wondering why you believe your touch would be welcome." The color drained from Lady Cecily's face. Around them, the titters died into shocked silence. "Your Grace, you merely presumed." He removed her hand from his arm with 2 fingers, as if picking up something distasteful. "It is a common failing among those who mistake beauty for worth. Do not make the mistake again." He turned and walked away, leaving Lady Cecily standing in a pool of mortified silence, her perfect composure shattered by a few devastating sentences. Philippa should have felt sympathy. Lady Cecily had been publicly humiliated in her own mother's ballroom, in front of everyone who mattered. But Philippa had spent too many years on the receiving end of Lady Cecily's own casual cruelties, the whispered comments about her figure, the pitying glances, the way Lady Cecily somehow always managed to be standing nearby when the most cutting remarks were made, to feel anything but a small, shameful spark of satisfaction. She made it through the first hour on sheer determination, standing at the edge of the ballroom with a glass of champagne she barely touched, watching couple after couple take to the floor while her dance card remained pristinely, mockingly empty. She smiled when people glanced her way, nodded pleasantly when forced into conversation, and tried not to count the minutes until she could reasonably excuse herself. Now, here's something worth understanding about the marriage market of 1856 London. A young woman's value was calculated with mathematical precision, her dowry weighed against her beauty, her connections balanced against her age, her virtue measured against her prospects. By 24, Philippa Hartwell had already exceeded the acceptable window for matrimony. Most women her age were married with children. She was standing alone at a ball, watching her younger sister collect proposals like flowers. The longer she remained unmarried, the more desperate her family situation became, and the more Lady Minerva's disappointment curdled into something closer to contempt. It was nearing 11 o'clock when Philippa finally escaped, The ballroom had grown unbearably hot, the crush of bodies pressing in until she couldn't breathe, and she slipped through a servant's entrance she had discovered at a previous gathering, emerging into the blessed cool of Lady Ashworth's garden. The night air was crisp, with the first hints of autumn, carrying the scent of late roses and turned earth. Moonlight silvered the formal hedges and gravel paths, transforming the garden into something from a fairy story. Beautiful and slightly unreal, a place where the rules of the ballroom might not apply. Philippa walked until she reached the ornamental pond at the garden's heart, where a family of swans floated serenely on the dark water. She settled onto a stone bench, her deep green gown pooling around her, and finally, allowed herself to feel. The tears came quietly at first, sliding down her cheeks with the restraint she had learned so painfully over the years. But then something cracked inside her, and she found herself crying in earnest, great racking sobs that shook her entire body, releasing years of accumulated pain into the indifferent night. She was so lost in her grief that she didn't hear the footsteps approaching. The swans prefer seed to cake, but they'll eat both if offered. Philippa startled so violently that she nearly fell from the bench, her hands flying to her face in a futile attempt to hide the evidence of her tears. A man stood on the path a few feet away, his features obscured by shadow, but his voice was rich and dark, with a hint of amusement that felt more conspiratorial than mocking. "I beg your pardon," she managed, her voice thick with crying. "I didn't realize anyone else was. I should return to the ballroom." "Should you?" He stepped forward, moonlight catching the sharp planes of his face, and Philippa felt her breath stop. In her chest, it was him, the Duke of Whitmore, the man who had just humiliated Lady Cecily Ashworth with a few cold words. The man every woman in England wanted, and no woman had ever captured. He should not have been in Lady Ashworth's garden. He should not have been speaking to her. "I asked if you should return," he said, moving closer. "Not if you would. There's a difference. The ballroom is quite crowded. The ballroom is full of people who don't deserve your company." He stopped an arm's length from her bench, close enough that she could see the unusual pale gray of his eyes, could smell the sandalwood cologne that clung to his evening clothes. "Why are you crying?" The question was so direct, so utterly lacking in the social cushioning that characterized polite conversation, that Philippa found herself answering honestly before she could remember to lie. "Because it's my birthday, and no one remembered." Her voice cracked on the admission. "Because I've spent another evening standing alone while my sister collects suitors like trophies. Because I am 24 years old today, and I have finally accepted that no one will ever—" She stopped, horrified at herself. "Forgive me, Your Grace. I don't know why I said, you must think me pathetic. I think," he said slowly, "that you are the only honest person I have encountered in months of this insufferable season." He reached into his coat and withdrew something that glinted in the moonlight, a flask, elegant and silver, clearly expensive. He unscrewed the cap and held it out to her. "Whiskey. Scottish. Far better than the champagne they're serving inside." When she hesitated, something that might have been a smile ghosted across his severe features. "I promise it's not poisoned. I have far more creative methods of disposing of people who bore me." Philippa took the flask. The whiskey burned going down, spreading warmth through her chest and loosening the tight knot of misery that had made it so hard to breathe. "Better?" he asked. She nodded, not trusting her voice. "Good." He settled onto the bench beside her, as if she were the sort of woman a duke would choose to sit with, and looked out over the moon-silvered pond. "Tell me, Miss Hartwell, how many hours have you spent at this ball?" She blinked at the use of her name. She hadn't realized he knew it. 3, Your Grace. Perhaps 4. And in those 3 or 4 hours, how many men have asked you to dance? The humiliation of the answer burned in her cheeks. None. None. He turned to look at her, and his expression was unreadable. And yet you remain. You stand in that ballroom, enduring the whispers and the stares and the cruelty of people who are not fit to breathe the same air as you, and you remain. Why? Because my mother. She stopped. Because I have no choice. Because if I hide, it only makes the rumors worse. What rumors? Philippa laughed, a harsh sound without humor. That I am unmarriageable. That my figure. She gestured helplessly at herself, at the body she had learned to hate. That no man could possibly want. Her voice broke again, and she pressed her hand to her mouth. The Duke was silent for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice had changed. Lower, rougher, stripped of its aristocratic distance. When I was a boy, he said, my father took me to Italy. We visited the galleries, the churches, the private collections of men who had spent fortunes preserving beauty. Do you know what I saw there, Miss Hartwell? What every great master, from Botticelli to Rubens to Titian, chose to celebrate. She shook her head, not understanding. Women, he said simply. Women with curves and softness and abundance. Women whose bodies were painted with reverence, worshipped as the pinnacle of feminine beauty. Women who looked, Miss Hartwell, remarkably like you. Philippa stared at him, certain she had misheard. Your Grace. The narrow, sharp-boned aesthetic currently fashionable in English ballrooms is not beauty. It is deprivation elevated to virtue. It is women starving themselves to meet standards set by people who understand nothing of art, of history, of what actually draws the eye and quickens the heart. His gray eyes held hers with an intensity that made her skin prickle. You have been told lies your entire life. Every whisper, every cruel comment, every moment you have been made to feel ashamed of your body. Lies. All of it. She wanted to believe him. God, how she wanted to believe him. But 24 years of cruelty had left their mark, and the old, familiar voice in her head whispered that this must be a trick, a cruel joke, some elaborate setup for a humiliation she couldn't yet see coming. Why are you saying this to me? She whispered. Because it's true. Because someone should have told you years ago. Because... He stopped, something flickering in his expression that she couldn't identify. Because I am tired, Miss Hartwell. Tired of watching fools dismiss what they lack the vision to appreciate. Tired of standing in ballrooms full of painted faces and calculated smiles and not seeing a single genuine thing. Tired of women like Lady Cecily Ashworth, who believe their beauty entitles them to everything while offering nothing of value in return. He rose from the bench, and Philippa felt an irrational surge of loss, as if something precious were slipping through her fingers. Return to the ballroom, he said. Or don't. But know this. You are not what they see when they look at you. You are infinitely more than their small minds can comprehend. And then he was gone, disappearing into the shadows as silently as he had appeared, leaving Philippa alone with the swans and the moonlight and a heart that didn't know what to do with the impossible thing that had just happened. She didn't return to the ballroom that night. She sat in the garden until the cold drove her inside, and then she found her mother and pleaded a headache, and spent the carriage ride home in silence, turning the Duke's words over and over in her mind like precious stones. He had called her beautiful. No one had ever called her beautiful. She told herself it meant nothing. He was a duke, notoriously eccentric, probably just amusing himself at her expense. She would never see him again. never speak to him again, and in a week she would convince herself the whole encounter had been a dream. But she was wrong, because Lysander Vane, 6th Duke of Whitmore, had looked at Philippa Hartwell that night and seen something that made his cold, calculating heart do things it had never done before. And he was not a man who let go of things he wanted. The weeks that followed Lady Ashworth's ball were strange ones for Philippa. On the surface, nothing had changed. She still attended the same gatherings, still endured the same whispers, still watched her dance card remain empty while Honoria's overflowed. But something inside her had shifted, some small kernel of doubt planted in the certainty of her own worthlessness. She began to notice things she had trained herself not to see. The paintings in the galleries they visited, where the women celebrated on canvas, bore bodies far more like hers than her sisters. The older, married women at dinner parties, many of them comfortable in their curves, who were treated with respect and even admiration by their husbands. The way the current fashion for extreme slenderness was, in fact, a recent invention. Her grandmother's generation had padded their figures to achieve the silhouette now mocked as grotesque. And she noticed the Duke of Whitmore. He was everywhere suddenly, or perhaps he had always been there, and she had simply never looked. He appeared at balls she attended, standing at the edge of the room with that cold, assessing gaze that made debutantes tremble and ambitious mothers plot. He was at the opera when her mother dragged her to Lord Pemberton's box. He was at the British Museum when she escaped one dreary afternoon to look at the antiquities. He was at church on Sunday mornings, his dark head bowed in what might have been prayer, or might have been the particular concentration of a man planning something. He never spoke to her, never approached her, never acknowledged her existence with more than the briefest nod of greeting that could have been directed at anyone. But she felt his eyes on her, felt them tracking her across crowded rooms, noting who she spoke to, how she moved, what she wore. It should have been unsettling, would have been unsettling from any other man. But there was something in that steady regard that didn't feel predatory. It felt like protection, like a sentinel watching over treasure. The attention did not go unnoticed. The Duke of Whitmore was staring at you again, Honoria whispered one evening at the Viscount Ashmore's card party. All through dinner, I thought Lady Cecily was going to shatter her wine glass from gripping it so hard. Don't be ridiculous. Philippa focused on her needlework, refusing to look up. He was probably staring at someone behind me. There's a wall behind you, dearest. Honoria's voice was gentle, without the mockery that might have colored their mother's observation. He was definitely looking at you, and Lady Cecily was definitely furious about it. Lady Cecily had, in fact, spent the evening in a state of barely concealed rage. Since the humiliation at her mother's ball, she had redoubled her efforts to capture the Duke's attention, appearing at every gathering he attended, engineering introductions through mutual acquaintances even, it was rumored, writing him letters that went conspicuously unanswered. His continued indifference was becoming a scandal in itself, whispered about in drawing rooms across London. But his attention to Philippa, that was something new. Something that didn't fit any pattern Lady Cecily could understand or counter. What happened at Lady Ashworth's ball? Honoria asked, reaching over to still Philippa's restless hands. You've been different since then. Quieter, but also brighter somehow, like something woke up inside you. Philippa couldn't answer. She couldn't explain the garden, the moonlight, the impossible conversation that had planted seeds of doubt in the certainty of her own ugliness. She couldn't tell her sister that a duke had called her beautiful, and she had spent every night since wondering if it was possible he had meant it. Nothing happened, she said. I simply grew tired of being miserable. But Honoria was not convinced, and neither was Lady Cecily. 3 weeks after the Ashworth ball, Lady Cecily cornered Philippa in the ladies' retiring room at the Pemberton Music Hall. "Miss Hartwell," Lady Cecily's smile was sharp as a blade. "How lovely to see you out and about. I had heard you were unwell, something about your constitution being unable to support the rigors of the season." The lie was deliberate, designed to wound. Philippa felt the familiar heat of humiliation climbing her cheeks, but she refused to look away. "You were misinformed, Lady Cecily. My health is quite robust." "Is it? How fortunate." Lady Cecily moved closer, her golden beauty somehow turned predatory in the candlelight. "I couldn't help noticing that the Duke of Whitmore has been paying you attention of late. Peculiar attention, some might say. The sort of attention that makes people wonder what services you might be providing to earn it." The insinuation was filthy, unmistakable. Philippa's hands trembled with the effort of not slapping the smirk off Lady Cecily's perfect face. "I have provided the Duke with nothing but polite conversation, Lady Cecily. Unlike some, I do not throw myself at men who have made their disinterest abundantly clear." Lady Cecily's expression flickered, a flash of rage quickly suppressed. "You think yourself clever, don't you? The fat spinster who somehow caught a duke's eye. But I know what you are, Miss Hartwell. I know what all of London knows, that you are desperate and grasping, and so pathetically grateful for any scrap of male attention that you would debase yourself in ways a true lady would never." "Lady Cecily." The voice came from the doorway, cold as a winter grave. "I believe you were just leaving." They both turned to find the Duke of Whitmore standing in the entrance to the ladies' retiring room, a space no gentleman should enter, a breach of propriety so severe that it would be talked about for weeks. He didn't seem to care. His gray eyes were fixed on Lady Cecily, with an expression that made the color drain from her face. "I heard every word," he said softly. "Every vile, jealous, contemptible word. And I find myself wondering, Lady Cecily, what I ever did to make you believe such behavior would be tolerated in my presence. Your Grace, you were simply demonstrating exactly why I find you repulsive." He stepped into the room, his presence seeming to fill the small space until there was no air left to breathe. "You are beautiful, Lady Cecily. I will grant you that. But beauty without kindness is merely a shell, pretty to look at, empty within. You have spent your entire life trading on your appearance, never bothering to develop the character that might make you worthy of the attention you so desperately crave." Lady Cecily made a small, wounded sound. "Your Grace, Miss Hartwell," Lysander continued, turning to Philippa with an expression that softened almost imperceptibly, "possesses more worth in her smallest finger than you contain in your entire gilded form. She is kind to servants and children and animals. She volunteers at foundling hospitals while you spend your mornings being fitted for gowns. She has endured 24 years of cruelty from people like you, and emerged with her capacity for compassion intact. She is, in short, everything you will never be." The silence in the retiring room was absolute. Lady Cecily stood frozen, her face a mask of humiliated fury. Philippa could only stare at the Duke, her heart hammering so hard she was certain everyone could hear it. "Come," Lysander said, offering Philippa his arm. "I find the air in here has grown toxic." She took his arm and let him lead her out, past Lady Cecily's shattered composure, through the crowded music hall where every head turned to watch them pass, into the cool night air of the Pemberton Terrace. "You shouldn't have done that," Philippa said when they were alone. "Lady Cecily will never forgive. Lady Cecily's forgiveness is worth precisely nothing to me." Lysander's voice was clipped, still carrying the edge of anger. "She will learn, as everyone will learn, that harming you carries consequences." But the scandal. You entered the ladies' retiring room. I would have entered a burning building if that was where you were, being attacked. He turned to face her, and something in his expression made her breath catch. I have tried, Miss Hartwell, to keep my distance, to court you properly, through observation and patience, and the gradual building of regard. But I find that my patience has limits, and watching that venomous creature spew her poison at you has exceeded them. Court me? Philippa whispered. You've been courting me? For 7 weeks, since the moment I saw you in that garden. His jaw tightened. I had planned to wait longer, to give you time to know me, to trust me, before I made my intentions clear. But circumstances have forced my hand. Before Philippa could respond, a commotion arose from inside the house, raised voices, the sound of a woman crying, and then Lady Minerva burst onto the terrace, her face mottled with fury. "Philippa!" Her voice was a whip crack. "What have you done? Lady Cecily is in hysterics. Lord Pemberton is demanding to know why his musical has been disrupted. And I have just heard the most extraordinary rumor about you and—" She stopped dead as she registered the Duke's presence. "Your Grace, I did not realize." Lady Hartwell, Lysander's voice had returned to its icy composure. "How convenient that you should join us. I was just about to inform your daughter that I intend to marry her." The words fell into silence like stones into still water. Lady Minerva's face went through a remarkable series of expressions: shock, disbelief, calculation, and finally a sycophantic smile that made Philippa's stomach turn. "Your Grace, what wonderful news! I always knew Philippa had hidden qualities." "You knew nothing of the sort." Lysander's interruption was brutal. "You have spent 24 years telling your daughter she was worthless, unlovable, an embarrassment to your family. You have starved her of affection while lavishing attention on your younger daughter. You have made her feel every single day that her body was a burden and her existence a mistake." Lady Minerva's face went white. "Your Grace, I don't know what lies she's been telling you. She has told me nothing. She didn't need to. I have eyes, Lady Hartwell. I have ears. And I have spent 7 weeks watching how you treat her. The cutting remarks, the dismissive glances, the way you position yourself so that she is always in shadow while your other daughter stands in light. I have only ever wanted what was best for my daughters. You have wanted what was best for yourself. And now—" Lysander smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. "Now you will get exactly what you deserve. I am going to marry Philippa, and you are going to spend the rest of your life watching her shine in the position you told her she would never achieve. You are going to attend balls where she is the guest of honor, and you are merely a footnote. You are going to sit in drawing rooms and hear people praise the daughter you dismissed, envy the match you thought impossible, marvel at the love you insisted she would never find." He stepped closer to Lady Minerva, his voice dropping to something almost intimate in its menace. "And at every single one of those gatherings, you will smile. You will praise your daughter. You will tell everyone who asks what a wonderful mother you were, how proud you are, how you always knew she was special. Because if you do not, if a single word of complaint or disappointment or criticism reaches my ears, I will destroy you, Lady Hartwell. Your social standing, your finances, your precious reputation. Everything you have built your life upon will crumble to dust, and you will spend your remaining years as the cautionary tale mothers tell their daughters about the price of cruelty." Lady Minerva looked like she might faint. "You cannot threaten me." "I am not threatening you. I am informing you of consequences." Lysander turned back to Philippa, and his entire demeanor softened. "Missy Hartwell, Philippa, I apologize for the manner of this proposal. It is not how I imagined it would happen. but I find I cannot wait another moment to ask you. Will you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Philippa looked at him, at this cold, terrifying, impossibly devoted man who had just dismantled her mother with words alone, who had defended her against Lady Cecily, who had watched her for 7 weeks and seen something no one else had bothered to look for. "Yes," she whispered, and watched his face transform with joy so profound it took her breath away. The weeks between the proposal and the wedding were a gauntlet of social warfare. Lady Cecily, humiliated beyond endurance, launched a campaign of whispered poison against Philippa. Rumors circulated through every drawing room in London that Philippa had trapped the Duke through witchcraft, through blackmail, through seductions too scandalous to name, that she was secretly pregnant, that she had threatened to expose some dark secret of the Duke's past, that she had simply thrown herself at him so relentlessly that he'd agreed to marry her out of pity. The rumors should have devastated her. 3 months ago they would have. But Philippa found, to her surprise, that she simply didn't care. Not when Lysander appeared at her side at every gathering, his hand possessive on her back, his gray eyes daring anyone to voice their whispers aloud. Not when he sent her flowers every morning, not delicate bouquets suitable for a lady, but armfuls of wild roses and autumn branches, things that smelled of gardens and freedom. Not when he wrote her letters that made her laugh and blush in equal measure, letters she kept in a locked box beside her bed and read every night before sleep. She was beginning to believe. Not completely. 24 years of cruelty could not be undone in weeks. But the seeds the Duke had planted in that moonlit garden were beginning to grow, reaching toward a light she had never imagined she would feel. And then there was the incident at the Pemberton dinner party. Lord Reginald Pemberton was a man of modest fortune, middling connections, and outsized ambition. At 43, he had buried 2 wives and was actively seeking a third, his preferences running to young women from families desperate enough to overlook his reputation for cruelty in exchange for his title and income. Lady Minerva had been cultivating his attention toward Honoria before the Duke's intervention. Now, with Philippa suddenly valuable as the future Duchess of Whitmore, Pemberton had shifted his focus. Not because he wanted Philippa for herself. He found her figure distasteful and her manner insufficiently submissive, but because taking what a duke desired carried its own particular satisfaction. The dinner was a nightmare from the first course. Philippa had been seated beside Lord Pemberton, a placement engineered by the man himself, using the social connections Lady Cecily had quietly provided. The Viscount spent the meal leaning too close, his breath sour with wine, his hand finding excuses to touch her arm, her shoulder, the curve of her waist. "You've become quite the prize, Miss Hartwell," he murmured during a lull in conversation. "All those years standing in corners, and now every eye in London is upon you. Tell me, how does it feel to be wanted for the first time in your life?" Philippa's skin crawled. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean, my lord." "Don't you?" His hand settled on her knee beneath the table, heavy and proprietary. "I find myself wondering what attractions you possess that could capture such illustrious attention. The Duke is known for his discriminating tastes, and yet he chose you." His fingers tightened. "Perhaps you have skills that aren't immediately apparent." "Remove your hand," Philippa said, her voice low and shaking. "Remove it now, or I will scream." "Will you?" Lord Pemberton's smile showed too many teeth. "And tell everyone that you encouraged my attention, that you welcomed my touch, that you are exactly the sort of desperate, wanting creature society has always believed you to be. Go ahead, my dear. I look forward to watching your reputation shatter into pieces." His hand crept higher, fingers digging into her thigh through layers of fabric. Philippa looked around desperately, but the other guests were engaged in their own conversations, and her mother was watching from across the table with an expression that said plainly, "Endure it, you foolish girl. Whatever happens, don't make a scene." Philippa's vision blurred with tears of rage and helplessness. She was trapped, utterly trapped, by the same society that had spent her entire life teaching her she was worthless. She would scream and be disbelieved. She would suffer in silence and be violated. There was no option that did not end in her humiliation. And then a hand closed around Lord Pemberton's wrist with enough force to make him gasp. Philippa turned to find a man standing behind the Viscount's chair, a man she didn't recognize, tall and broad-shouldered, with the quiet competence of someone trained in violence. He was dressed as a servant, but the way he held Pemberton's wrist suggested he was something else entirely. "His Grace requests your presence in the study, my lord," the man said pleasantly. "Immediately." "I'm in the middle of dinner. Immediately." The word carried a weight that made Pemberton go pale. The man, the Duke's man, Philippa realized with dawning comprehension, released Pemberton's wrist and stepped back, his posture relaxed, but his eyes watchful. Pemberton rose from the table with what dignity he could muster, muttering excuses about urgent business, and followed the servant out of the dining room. He did not return. Philippa sat in frozen silence, her heart hammering, her thigh still burning from the pressure of unwanted fingers. Around her, the dinner continued as if nothing had happened, because to these people, nothing had. A Viscount leaving a dinner party was unremarkable. What had almost happened to Philippa beneath the table was, by the standards of their world, equally unremarkable. But someone had seen. Someone had intervened. Someone had been watching. The Duke appeared at the door of the dining room an hour later, his expression as cold as she had ever seen it. He crossed directly to her chair, ignoring the startled murmurs of the other guests, and offered his hand. "Miss Hartwell, I believe you've had enough of this gathering." She took his hand and let him lead her out, past the shocked faces and the whispered speculation, into the cool night air where his carriage waited. "How did you know?" she asked once they were inside, the door closed against the watching world. "I have people in every house that matters." His voice was flat, controlled, but she could see the rage simmering beneath the surface. "The moment Pemberton touched you, I knew. I was already on my way when my man extracted him." "Extracted?" Philippa's voice trembled. "What did you do to him?" "Nothing permanent. Yet." Lysander's jaw tightened. "I've had a conversation with Lord Pemberton about the consequences of touching things that don't belong to him. He has agreed to leave London for an extended period, several years, most likely." "Agreed?" "I can be very persuasive when properly motivated." He reached across the carriage and took her hands, his grip gentle despite the violence she had glimpsed in his eyes. "Are you hurt? Did he, before my man arrived, did he?" "No!" Philippa's voice broke. "No, he only touched my leg. But if you hadn't, if your man hadn't—" "I will always have someone watching," Lysander said. "Always. Until the day I die and beyond. If I can arrange it, there will be someone between you and any person who wishes you harm. This I swear to you, Philippa. No one will ever touch you again without your consent. No one will ever make you feel powerless or trapped or afraid. You are mine now, and I protect what is mine with every resource at my disposal." She should have been frightened by the intensity of his devotion, by the casual mention of surveillance, of people in every house, of a possessiveness that bordered on obsession. Instead, she felt something she had never felt before. Safe. The wedding took place 3 weeks later, in a ceremony so lavish that it was talked about for years afterward. The Duke of Whitmore had spared no expense. Silk from India for her gown, hothouse flowers from his own estates, a wedding breakfast that fed 300 guests on dishes prepared by the finest chef in London. Lady Cecily Ashworth was not invited. Lord Pemberton was not invited. Lady Minerva was invited, but her seat was in the back of the church, far from the altar where her daughter stood radiant in cream silk and diamonds. When the ceremony concluded, she was required to curtsy to her own child. Now, the Duchess of Whitmore, outranking everyone she had ever envied, and offer public congratulations in a voice loud enough for all to hear. "My darling Philippa," Lady Minerva said, the words clearly costing her something vital. "I always knew you were destined for greatness." "Did you, Mama?" Philippa's smile was serene. "How fortunate that the Duke helped you remember." The wedding breakfast featured a surprise that Lysander had kept hidden until the last moment. A portrait unveiled in the main hall, commissioned from the finest artist in England. It showed Philippa as she had been at the Ashworth ball, standing alone by the swan pond in her deep green gown, moonlight silvering her hair. But in this version, she was not crying. She was looking directly at the viewer with an expression of quiet strength, her full figure rendered with the reverent attention of a Renaissance master celebrating feminine beauty. Below the portrait, a small plaque read, "The moment I knew." 7 months ago, Lysander said quietly, standing beside her as the guests gathered to admire his gift. "I saw you from the terrace, walking toward the garden. I followed you without understanding why. I, who never followed anyone anywhere. And when I found you there, with tears on your face, and cake in your hand, and swans gathering at your feet, I knew that I would move heaven and earth to make you smile instead." Philippa felt tears sliding down her cheeks, but for the first time in her memory, they were not tears of grief or shame or despair. "I don't deserve this," she whispered. "You deserve infinitely more." He cupped her face in his hands, right there in front of 300 wedding guests, and kissed her with a tenderness that made several matrons reach for their smelling salts. "And I will spend the rest of my life proving it to you." The wedding night that followed the breakfast was everything Lysander had promised. Worship in its purest form, administered with patience and skill, and devastating tenderness. But first, he showed her the room. They stood before a locked door at the end of a long hallway in Whitmore House, and Philippa felt her heart hammering in her chest as Lysander unfastened 3 separate mechanisms. "What you see in this room may frighten you," he said quietly. "It would frighten most people. But I want you to understand the depth of my obsession, Philippa, because I want there to be no secrets between us. No hidden corners where doubts can fester. I am showing you my madness so that you can decide whether you can love a madman." He pushed the door open. The room beyond was larger than Philippa had expected, lit by dozens of candles that cast a warm glow over walls, covered, completely covered, with images of her, paintings in oil and watercolor, sketches in charcoal and pencil, miniatures in delicate ivory. There were images of her at balls, standing in corners with her empty dance card, images of her in the park, walking alone while society swept past without seeing her, images of her in the garden at Lady Ashworth's ball, moonlight silvering her hair as she wept beside the swan pond. There were images of her laughing, though she could not imagine when anyone had seen her laugh. Images of her reading, her brow furrowed in concentration. Images of her kind, helping a servant gather dropped packages, offering her seat to an elderly woman, bending to speak to a child who had lost its mother in a crowd. And there were images of her body, not vulgar, not exploitative, but reverent. studies of the curve of her shoulder, the line of her neck, the way her figure moved beneath her gowns, each one executed with the loving attention of an artist, capturing something precious, something sacred, something worth preserving against the ravages of time. In the center of the room stood a desk, and on that desk, "Reports," Lysander said, moving to stand beside her. "From investigators I hired to learn everything about you. Your favorite books, your charitable work at the Foundling Hospital, the way you treat servants and shopkeepers and people who can offer you nothing in return. Your childhood," his voice caught. "Your childhood, Philippa. The things your mother said to you. The things she made you believe about yourself." Philippa's vision blurred with tears. "You knew. All this time you knew what I knew everything. I made it my business to know everything because I could not afford to be wrong about you. I had to be certain, before I claimed you, that you were exactly who I believed you to be." He turned her to face him, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "And you are. You are kind and brave and intelligent and strong. You are patient and generous and loyal. You have endured cruelty that would have broken most people, and you emerged with your capacity for compassion intact. You are, Philippa Hartwell, Philippa Vane, the best person I have ever known, and I am more in love with you than I have words to express." "This is madness," she whispered, but she was smiling through her tears. "This entire room is madness." "Yes," he smiled back, and it transformed his face into something young and vulnerable and achingly beautiful. "But it's your madness now. Everything I am, everything I have built, every dark and obsessive corner of my soul, it's all yours, if you'll have it." Philippa looked around the room, at the evidence of 7 months of devoted surveillance, of careful study, of an obsession that should have terrified her, but somehow felt exactly right. "I'll have it," she said. "I'll have you. All of you." And when he kissed her, there in the center of his shrine to her existence, Philippa finally understood what it meant to be loved. He carried her to the bedchamber after that, laying her down on sheets of finest silk, and proceeded to do exactly what he had promised on their wedding night. He worshipped her. He mapped her body with his hands and his mouth, learning every curve, celebrating every softness, murmuring praise against her skin until she was trembling with need. When she tried to cover herself, old instincts dying hard, he gently moved her hands aside and kissed the places she had tried to hide. "Beautiful," he said against the curve of her hip. "Perfect," against the swell of her breast. "Mine," against the soft roundness of her belly that she had hated her entire life. And when he finally joined them together, she cried out, not from pain, but from the overwhelming rightness of it, of him, of them, of everything they were building together from the ruins of her self-doubt. Afterward, he held her close and whispered things against her hair that made her heart ache with their tenderness. "I will never let anyone hurt you again," he promised. "Not your mother, not Lady Cecily, not Pemberton, or anyone like him. You are the Duchess of Whitmore now, and everyone who ever made you feel small will spend the rest of their lives regretting it." "Lysander," she murmured, half asleep and wholly content. "What happened to Lord Pemberton?" "Really? He has decided to relocate to Australia." Lysander's voice was calm, almost bored. "The climate, you understand, very beneficial for certain conditions." "What conditions?" "The condition of having touched my wife without her consent." His arm tightened around her. "His creditors will be calling in his debts next week. His shipping investments have suffered a series of unfortunate reversals, and there are certain documents concerning his previous wives that will find their way to the appropriate authorities if he ever returns to England. Philippa should have been shocked, should have protested that such vengeance was excessive, that she didn't need him to fight her battles, that compassion was better than cruelty. Instead, she smiled against his chest. And Lady Cecily? Lady Cecily's mother has discovered some rather compromising letters her daughter wrote to a married baron last year. The resulting scandal has made Lady Cecily unwelcome in several houses, where she was previously the toast of the evening. I'm told she's considering an extended visit to relatives in Scotland. Did you forge the letters? I didn't need to. Lady Cecily wrote them herself. I merely ensured they reached the right audience at the right moment. He pressed a kiss to her forehead. She should not have called you a creature like that. Words have consequences, my love. She is learning hers. Philippa laughed, actually laughed, for what felt like the first time in years, and pulled him closer. You're a terrible person, she said. Yes, he agreed. But I'm your terrible person. And I will be terrible to everyone who deserves it for the rest of my life, as long as you remain by my side. I'm not going anywhere. Good. He rolled over her, his gray eyes burning in the candlelight. Because I'm not nearly finished worshipping you yet. The months that followed were a revelation. Philippa discovered that being the Duchess of Whitmore was nothing like she had imagined. She had expected coldness, isolation, the particular loneliness of being married to a man who had chosen her for mysterious reasons, but did not actually want her company. Instead, she found herself at the center of a life more full and warm than anything she had ever experienced. Lysander was, as he had warned her, possessive beyond reason. He wanted her with him always, at breakfast, at dinner, during his meetings with estate managers and solicitors, in the evenings, when he sat in his study going through correspondence. He consulted her on decisions affecting the estate, asked her opinion on matters of household management, treated her as a partner rather than an ornament. And every night, every single night, he made good on his promise to worship her. She learned what he meant when he called her beautiful. She learned that the softness he loved could be pressed against his hardness in ways that made them both gasp. She learned that her curves fit perfectly in his hands, that her body was capable of pleasures she had never imagined, that the shame she had carried for 24 years had been nothing but lies. 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 The first test of her new position came 3 months after the wedding, at the first ball of the spring season. It was hosted by the Duchess of Devonshire, and the invitation had arrived with a personal note requesting that the Duke and Duchess of Whitmore do her the honor of attending. The guest list read like a directory of everyone who had ever mocked Philippa, dismissed her, made her feel invisible. Lady Cecily would be there, recently returned from her Scottish exile and desperate to reclaim her position in society. Lord Pemberton would not. He was still in Australia, his fortune in ruins. But his friends and allies would attend, their eyes sharp with curiosity about the woman who had somehow brought down one of their own. And Lady Minerva would be there, still bound by the Duke's threats to smile and praise her daughter, no matter what it cost her. I don't want to go, Philippa said on the morning of the ball, standing before her dressing-room mirror in a robe of silk, while her maid prepared her gown. Lysander appeared behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. You don't have to go. We can send our regrets. We can claim illness, prior engagements, complete disinterest in the company of people who don't deserve to breathe the same air as you. But, he met her eyes in the mirror. If you go, you will show them what they lost. You will walk into that ballroom on my arm, wearing a gown that cost more than most of them earn in a year, and you will be the Duchess of Whitmore, in fact, as well as name. Every person who ever dismissed you will have to curtsy to you. Every woman who mocked your figure will have to watch while I worship you on the dance floor. Every man who passed you over will spend the rest of the evening kicking himself for his blindness. That sounds like revenge. It is revenge. The best kind. Success. He turned her to face him, his hands gentle on her shoulders. But only if you want it. Only if you're ready. There is no pressure, Philippa. We have our entire lives for you to take your place in society. It doesn't have to be tonight. Philippa looked at him, at this man who had built a shrine to her existence, who had destroyed her enemies without mercy, who had shown her night after night that her body was not a burden, but a gift. And she made a choice. I want to go, she said. I want them to see. His smile was like the sun breaking through storm clouds. Then let's give them something to see. The gown he had commissioned for her was midnight blue velvet, cut to emphasize rather than hide her figure. It had a bodice that showcased her curves, a waist that accentuated her silhouette, and a skirt that moved like water when she walked. The diamonds at her throat were the Whitmore family jewels, worth a king's ransom, sparkling with every breath. When Philippa descended the grand staircase of Devonshire House on her husband's arm, every eye in the ballroom turned to watch. The whispers started immediately, but they were not the whispers Philippa had endured for 24 years. They were not cruel or mocking or pitying. They were awed. She's beautiful, someone breathed. Look at the way he watches her. I've never seen the Duke look at anyone like that. Do you know, I always thought there was something special about her, something the others missed. Lady Cecily stood near the refreshment table, her golden beauty dimmed somehow, her famous smile strained as she watched the woman she had tormented take her rightful place in society. When Philippa passed close enough to speak, Lady Cecily dropped into a curtsy so deep it bordered on mockery. "Your Grace," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "What a pleasure to see you out in society. I had heard you were keeping to yourself these days. Some sort of health issue, I believe." It was the same insinuation she had used before, designed to suggest that Philippa's body made her unsuitable for public viewing. 3 months ago, it would have worked. Philippa would have flushed with shame, stammered an excuse, retreated to the shadows where she belonged. But Philippa was not the woman she had been 3 months ago. "Lady Cecily," she said, her voice pitched to carry. "How kind of you to ask after my health. I assure you, I have never felt better. Marriage agrees with me tremendously. Though I suppose you wouldn't know anything about that, would you? I understand proposals have been scarce since your return from Scotland." The gasps from the surrounding crowd were audible. Lady Cecily's face went white, then red, then white again. "Your Grace, I was merely expressing concern. Your concern is noted and dismissed." Philippa smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. "Now, if you'll excuse me, my husband is waiting to dance with me. Some of us have partners eager for our company." She walked away without looking back, leaving Lady Cecily standing in a pool of mortified silence, while the cream of London society pretended not to have witnessed her complete and utter devastation. Lysander was waiting at the edge of the dance floor, his gray eyes bright with something that looked remarkably like pride. "That was ruthless," he said, as he led her into the waltz. "I learned from the best." "You learned from yourself." His arm tightened around her waist, pulling her scandalously close. "I never taught you to be cruel, Philippa. You discovered that capacity all on your own, and I find, to my surprise, that I am devastatingly attracted to this new side of you. You created a monster. I created a duchess." He spun her through the crowd, ignoring the whispers that followed, their progress. "And I could not be prouder of her." At midnight, when the dancing was at its height, Lysander led her to the center of the ballroom and raised his hand for silence. The orchestra stopped. The conversations died. Every eye turned to the Duke and Duchess of Whitmore, standing together beneath a crystal chandelier that cast rainbows across their evening clothes. "Ladies and gentlemen," Lysander said, his voice carrying easily across the crowded room, "I wish to make an announcement. 7 months ago, I attended a ball at Lady Ashworth's home. I went expecting to be bored, irritated, and desperate to leave within the hour, as I am at most social gatherings." Scattered laughter rippled through the crowd. The Duke was not known for his love of society. "Instead," he continued, "I found something I had spent my entire life believing did not exist. I found a woman of genuine kindness, extraordinary courage, and breathtaking beauty. A woman who had been dismissed and mocked and made to feel invisible by a society that prizes the superficial over the substantial. A woman who, despite 24 years of cruelty, remained compassionate and generous and good in ways that most of us can only aspire to." His gray eyes found Philippa's and held them. "I found the woman I was going to marry. I knew it within 5 minutes of our first conversation. I spent 7 months planning how to make her mine, and I would have spent 7 years if necessary. 7 decades. The rest of my life." He took her hand and raised it to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles that somehow felt more intimate than anything they had done in their bedroom. "My wife is the Duchess of Whitmore, but more than that, more than any title or fortune or social standing, she is the best person I have ever known, and I am the luckiest man in England to call her mine." The applause that followed was thunderous, but Philippa barely heard it. She was too busy staring at her husband, at this cold, terrible, devoted man who had just declared his love for her in front of everyone who had ever made her feel worthless. "You didn't have to do that," she whispered. "I wanted to do that." He pulled her close, right there in the middle of the ballroom, with 300 guests watching and the entire social world of London drinking in every word. "I wanted every person in this room to understand exactly how I feel about you. I wanted them to know that the woman they dismissed is the woman I chose, not despite who she is, but because of it. I wanted them to spend the rest of their miserable lives regretting every cruel word, every cutting glance, every moment they made you feel less than you are." "That sounds like revenge." "It is revenge," he agreed. "The sweetest revenge of all, proving them wrong." Lady Minerva appeared at Philippa's elbow, her face a careful mask of maternal pride that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Darling," she said, loudly enough for the surrounding guests to hear. "What a beautiful speech. I always knew you and the Duke were perfectly matched." "Did you, Mama?" Philippa turned to face her mother, still holding Lysander's hand. "That's not what you told Lady Cecily at Lady Pemberton's tea party. What was it you said? That I was an embarrassment to the family. That you couldn't understand what madness had possessed his grace." The color drained from Lady Minerva's face. "Philippa, I never—" "You did. And I know you did, because my husband has informants in every house that matters, and they tell him everything." Philippa stepped closer to her mother, her voice dropping to something almost intimate. "But here is what you will do now, Mama. You will turn to the guests who are pretending not to listen to this conversation, and you will tell them how proud you are of me, how you always believed in me, how I am everything you could have hoped for in a daughter. Philippa, you will say it, Mama, and you will mean it, or at least sound like you mean it, because if you do not, my husband will ensure that Honoria never receives another marriage proposal from anyone worth having. He will ensure that your invitations dry up, your debts are called in, Your precious social standing crumbles to dust." Philippa smiled, and there was nothing warm in it. "He warned you once about the consequences of failing to praise me publicly. I am warning you now that those consequences are still very much in effect." Lady Minerva stood frozen, her face a mask of barely contained fury. But she was not a stupid woman, and she knew when she was beaten. She turned to the watching crowd, arranged her features into an expression of maternal warmth, and began to speak. "My daughter Philippa has always been the pride of our family," she said, her voice carrying across the ballroom. "Kind, intelligent, generous to a fault. I could not be more proud of the woman she has become, or more grateful that the Duke of Whitmore recognized in her what I have always known, that she is extraordinary in every way." The words were clearly costing her something vital, something that might have been called her soul if Philippa had believed her mother still possessed one. But she said them. She said them loudly enough for everyone to hear, and she said them with a smile that almost looked genuine. "Thank you, Mama," Philippa said sweetly. "I'm so glad we finally agree on something." She turned and walked away on her husband's arm, leaving Lady Minerva standing in a pool of public humiliation that was somehow infinitely worse than anything she had ever inflicted on her daughter. "You are terrifying," Lysander murmured as they moved through the crowd. "Absolutely, utterly terrifying. I have never been more in love with you than I am in this moment. I learned from the best. You learned from yourself." He pulled her through a side door into a darkened corridor where no one could see them. "And I'm going to take you home now and show you exactly how much your new ruthlessness appeals to me. We can't leave. It's not even 1 o'clock. We can do anything we want." He pressed her against the wall, his body hot and hard against hers. "We are the Duke and Duchess of Whitmore. Society exists to serve our pleasure, not the other way around. Someone might see. Let them see." He kissed her then, deep and demanding, one hand fisting in her hair, while the other traced the curves he had learned so thoroughly over the past 3 months. "Let them see that I worship my wife. Let them see that the woman they dismissed is the woman I cannot keep my hands off. Let them see everything they lost by being too blind, too stupid, too cruel to recognize what was standing in front of them all along." Philippa kissed him back with equal fervor, her hands finding the buttons of his waistcoat, her body arching into his with a shamelessness that would have horrified her former self. But her former self had believed lies about her own worth. Her former self had hidden in corners and accepted cruelty as her due. Her former self had been wrong about everything. This self, this new, fierce, beloved self, knew better. "Take me home," she said against his mouth. And he did. The destruction of Lord Pemberton was systematic, surgical, utterly devastating. Within a month of the wedding, his investments had collapsed. Within 2, his creditors were calling in debts he could not possibly pay. By spring, he had been forced to sell his London townhouse, his country estate, his art collection, everything he had accumulated over 4 decades of scheming and social climbing. But the financial ruin was only the beginning. The rumors started slowly. Whispers about his treatment of his previous wives, about the mysterious circumstances of their deaths, about the things he had done to servants and dependents who had no power to resist him. Investigation was demanded. Evidence emerged. By summer, Lord Reginald Pemberton was facing criminal charges that would see him transported to the colonies if convicted. He fled before the trial could conclude, disappearing onto a ship bound for Australia, and was never seen in England again. "Did you manufacture the evidence?" Philippa asked one evening, as they sat together in his study, reviewing the latest reports of Pemberton's downfall. "No." Lysander's expression was unreadable. "I merely ensured that evidence, which had been suppressed, was finally brought to light." His crimes were real, Philippa. His first wife died under suspicious circumstances. His second bore injuries that were inconsistent with the riding accident that killed her. The servants he abused, the women he violated, they all existed. They all suffered. I simply gave them the opportunity to finally be heard. And the financial destruction? That was more proactive. A ghost of a smile crossed his features. But no more than he deserved. He touched you, Philippa. He put his hand on you, without your consent. And he would have done far worse if my man hadn't intervened. For that alone, I would have destroyed him 10 times over. Philippa reached across the desk and took his hand. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Not just for stopping him, but for making sure he could never hurt anyone else." He touched what was mine. Lysander's grip tightened. Anyone who touches what is mine will learn the same lesson. I am not a forgiving man, Philippa. I am not a kind man. But I am, and will always be, entirely devoted to you. Lady Cecily's fall from grace was slower, but equally complete. The letters to the married baron were only the beginning. Over the following months, a series of unfortunate revelations emerged. Gambling debts Lady Cecily had hidden from her parents, a scandalous flirtation with a foreign diplomat, a pattern of cruelty towards servants that her family had covered up for years. One by one, the houses that had once welcomed her began to close their doors. The invitations that had once flooded her Morning Post slowed to a trickle, then stopped entirely. By the end of the season, Lady Cecily Ashworth was engaged to a minor baron with a crumbling estate in Yorkshire, a match so far beneath her expectations that her mother wept for a week. "Did you arrange all of it?" Philippa asked. "Only some of it." Lysander's smile was sharp. Lady Cecily had a gift for creating enemies. I merely ensured those enemies had the resources to strike back. That's still revenge. That's still justice. He pulled her into his lap, his hands settling on her hips with proprietary familiarity. "She called you a creature like that. She tried to destroy your reputation before we were even married. She conspired with your mother to undermine you at every turn. The life she's living now, married to a man she despises, trapped in a house she hates, surrounded by people who barely tolerate her presence, is exactly the life she tried to condemn you to. That's poetic. I've always had a flair for narrative symmetry. And Lady Minerva learned to play her role with the dedication of an actress performing the part of her life. She smiled at every gathering. She praised Philippa to anyone who would listen. She told stories about her daughter's childhood that painted herself as a devoted mother and Philippa as a beloved child. Stories that were so far from the truth they qualified as fantasy. And Philippa let her. Because watching her mother choke on false praise, watching her swallow her cruelty and pretend affection she had never felt, was its own particular form of revenge. "She hates this," Honoria said one afternoon, watching Lady Minerva hold court at a garden party. "Every word she says about you is like swallowing poison." "I know," Philippa said. "Doesn't that bother you? That her praise isn't real?" "Not anymore." Philippa watched her mother smile and simper and pretend, and felt nothing but distant satisfaction. "I spent 24 years desperate for her approval, Honoria. 24 years of trying to be good enough, pretty enough, small enough to earn her love. And it never worked, because her love was never available to me. It was always reserved for you, for her social ambitions, for the image of the family she wanted to present to the world." She turned to her sister, and her expression softened. "But I don't need her approval anymore. I have a husband who loves me exactly as I am. I have a life beyond anything I could have imagined. and I have the satisfaction of knowing that the mother who rejected me is now required to publicly adore me, whether she means it or not. That's not the relationship I wanted with her, but it's the relationship I have, and I'm choosing to be at peace with it. Honoria's eyes filled with tears. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm sorry I didn't protect you better. I'm sorry I let her treat you that way while You were a child, Honoria. We both were. Neither of us was responsible for Mama's choices." Philippa took her sister's hand. "But we can make different choices now. We can be sisters who support each other, who celebrate each other's successes, who refuse to let our mother's poison touch our relationship. I'd like that. So would I." They watched their mother together, two daughters who had survived very different forms of maternal failure, and found that their shared understanding was its own kind of healing. 5 years passed. 5 years in which Philippa Hartwell, the fat daughter no man would touch, transformed into the Duchess of Whitmore, one of the most influential women in England. She used her position not for social climbing or revenge, but for the kind of quiet, persistent good that creates real change. She funded scholarships for young women who were told they weren't good enough. She established homes for servants too old to work, for women escaping cruel marriages, for anyone who had been made to feel invisible by a world that valued only the beautiful and the powerful. And she raised her children, 2 daughters and a son, to understand that beauty came in all forms, that kindness mattered more than fashion, and that the opinions of small-minded people were worth precisely nothing. Her eldest daughter, named Rose after the flowers in the shrine room, had inherited her mother's curves and her father's fierce determination. At 6 years old, she had already informed a duchess's son that his opinions about her figure were stupid and wrong, a pronouncement that had made Lysander so proud he'd commissioned a portrait to commemorate the occasion. Her second daughter, 3-year-old Sophia, was slender like her aunt Honoria, but had Philippa's kind heart and her father's ruthless intelligence. She had recently organized a revolution among the household cats, the details of which remained mysterious, but had resulted in 3 broken vases and the permanent banishment of the nursemaid, who had called Rose fat. Her son, 2-year-old Alexander, was too young to have revealed much of his personality beyond a tendency to put everything in his mouth and an obvious preference for his mother's arms over anyone else's. But Lysander watched him with the particular intensity of a man planning decades of devoted fatherhood, and Philippa had no doubt that Alexander would grow up knowing he was loved beyond measure. Honoria had married a viscount who adored her, and the 2 families remained close, closer than they had ever been growing up, bonded now by mutual respect rather than divided by a mother's favoritism. Lady Minerva, required by the Duke's ongoing threats to maintain her facade of maternal devotion, had learned to play her role so well that some people actually believed she had always loved her elder daughter best. Lady Cecily Ashworth had borne 3 children to her minor baron, and was reportedly miserable in Yorkshire, surrounded by sheep and regret. Launtul, Pemberton had died of fever in Australia, unmourned and unremembered. And Lysander remained exactly what he had promised to be, cold to the world, but burning for his wife, possessive beyond reason, but utterly devoted. He still watched her with the same hungry intensity he had shown on their wedding night, still commissioned paintings of her for his private collection, still added to the shrine room that had become their secret place, filled now with 5 years of new evidence of his obsession. "I have something for you," he said one evening, as they sat together in his study after the children were asleep. "Another painting? Better." He handed her a folder of papers, thick with official seals. "The Hartwell estate. I purchased it last month. It's yours now. The house where your mother made you feel worthless. The gardens where you used to hide to cry, everything. I'm giving it to you, so you can do with it whatever you want." Philippa stared at the papers, her hands trembling. "You bought my childhood home. I bought the property where my wife suffered for 24 years. His voice was soft but fierce. "Tear it down. Convert it to a school for girls who've been told they're not good enough. Turn it into a museum dedicated to proving society wrong. Whatever you want, Philippa. It's yours." She looked up at him, at this terrible, devoted, obsessive man who had spent 5 years proving that she was worthy of love, and felt tears streaming down her cheeks. "I want to turn it into a home," she said quietly. "A home for women like me. Women who were told they were too big, too plain, too different to be loved. I want them to live in the house where I learned to hate myself, and I want them to learn in those same rooms that they are beautiful and valuable and worthy of everything good." Lysander's smile was devastating in its tenderness. "Then that is what we will do. You're still terrible, you know. Only to people who deserve it." He pulled her into his lap, his hand settling on her hips with the same proprietary familiarity they had always held. "To you, I am eternally, completely, obsessively devoted. That hasn't changed in 5 years. It won't change in 50. You're still watching me," she teased. "I see your men lurking in corners. I know you have informants in every house we visit." "Of course I do. You are the most valuable thing in my life, Philippa. I will never stop protecting you. I will never stop watching. I will never stop ensuring that no one can ever hurt you again." "That's madness. That's love." He kissed her then, deep and thorough and full of promise. "The most beautiful, terrifying, all-consuming love I have ever known. And I will spend the rest of my life proving it to you, one day at a time, until you believe me completely." "I believe you," she whispered against his mouth. "I've believed you for years." "Good, because I have 5 decades of worship still to give you, and I intend to make every moment count." On a golden autumn afternoon, remarkably like the one where our story began, Philippa stood in Lady Ashworth's garden, now the property of Lady Ashworth's daughter, who had finally escaped her mother's shadow and become a woman of her own, watching her eldest daughter chase a swan around the ornamental pond. "Careful, darling," she called out, one hand resting on the swell of her belly where her 4th child was growing. "The swans bite when they're annoyed." "She's just like her mother," Lysander said, appearing at her side with their 2 younger children in tow, absolutely fearless and absolutely convinced that every creature in the world wants to be her friend. "And is she wrong?" "No." He slipped his arm around her waist, pulling her close against his side. "She is, like her mother, entirely correct about everything." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching their children play. Alexander had discovered a frog and was attempting to show it to Sophia, who was pretending to be terrified while secretly plotting to steal it for her own collection. Rose had cornered the swan and was explaining something earnest about respect and boundaries, which the swan was ignoring entirely. "Lady Ashworth asked me if we would host the autumn ball next year," Philippa said. "She says she's getting too old for such things, and that Whitmore House has become the center of society since," she gestured vaguely, "since us." "And what did you tell her?" "I told her I would discuss it with my husband." Lysander turned her to face him, his gray eyes warm with the love that had only deepened over 5 years of marriage. "And what would my wife like to do?" Philippa considered. The autumn ball had been the setting of her greatest humiliation, standing alone while society mocked her, crying in the garden because no one had remembered her birthday, believing with every fiber of her being that she was unworthy of love, but it had also been the setting of her greatest gift, a duke in the moonlight, telling her truths she had never imagined hearing, changing the course of her life forever. "I want to host a ball," she said slowly, "where every woman who has ever been told she is not enough can come and feel beautiful, where every girl who is hidden in corners can dance in the center of the room, where every person who has been made invisible can finally be seen. And I want to host it here, in this garden, where everything began." "Then that is what we will do." Lysander kissed her forehead. "I'll have the invitations printed tomorrow." "Just like that?" "Just like that. You are the Duchess of Whitmore, Philippa. You can do anything you want." His smile was devastating in its tenderness. "And I will be right beside you, ensuring that anyone who tries to stop you regrets it for the rest of their miserable lives. You're still terrifying, you know. Only to people who deserve it." He pulled her closer. "To you, I am. Eternally, completely, obsessively devoted. That hasn't changed in 5 years. It won't change in 50. Rose had abandoned her swan educating project and was running toward them, her auburn hair flying behind her like a banner. "Mama! Papa! The swan says she wants to come to our ball!" "I'm not sure swans say things, darling," Philippa said, laughing. "This one does. She says she wants to wear a tiara and dance with all the lords." Lysander scooped his daughter into his arms. "Well, if the swan says so, we can hardly refuse. One must always honor the wishes of aristocratic waterfowl. Lysander, we are not inviting a swan to our ball." "Why not? We'll be inviting plenty of other graceless birds. Might as well include one that actually has the excuse of being poultry." "Lysander." But she was laughing with her whole face, her whole heart, in a way she had not known was possible before a duke walked into a garden and told her she was beautiful. The woman she had been 5 years ago would not have recognized herself. That woman had believed she was worthless, unlovable, destined to spend her life in shadowed corners, apologizing for existing. That woman had been wrong about everything. "Come," Lysander said, shifting Rose to one arm and extending his free hand to his wife. "Let's go home." Home. Whitmore House, with its gardens full of children and animals, its halls full of laughter, its secret room where her husband still added paintings to his shrine of devotion. Home, where she was loved beyond reason, protected beyond measure, seen exactly as she was, and celebrated for it. Philippa took his hand. "Yes," she said. "Let's go home. Now, as you step away from this story, I want you to think about something. About the words we use to describe bodies, the judgments we pass, the assumptions we make, the cruelties we deliver, without ever questioning whether they are true or kind or necessary. Philippa Hartwell spent 24 years believing she was worthless because her body did not match an arbitrary standard. How many women still believe that lie? This story reminds me why I started this channel. There's something powerful about tales of people who were overlooked finally being recognized, not because they changed themselves, but because someone finally saw them clearly. I think we all carry a little of that longing, the hope that we will be seen, truly seen, and loved for exactly who we are. Thank you for listening. Drop a comment and tell me, who in your life saw you when the world didn't? I read every single comment, and I'd love to know. Until next time, my friends, this has been the Duke's Revenge.